So tonight I'd like to pray and then give a little bit more focus on this. And so I've got the slides up on the screen, and for those who have joined us on Zoom, welcome. We can't see your faces yet, but as soon as a short video is done, we'll be able to include you in the mix. So let's go ahead and pray. Father in heaven, thank you for your word. Sometimes we don't really understand it, and we want to. Please give us your Holy Spirit, give us wisdom, and help us to rightly divide the word of truth, not going off, twisting scripture to, as Peter puts it, our own destruction, but to be renewed by scripture, for it to cut our hearts and transform us. And we pray this in Jesus' name, amen. So how many of you have been enjoying Leviticus? Yeah, good. Yeah. It's one of those books that's got lots and lots of detail, doesn't it? And sometimes you're like, I just read this, didn't I? What's the difference between this offering and that offering? And there's some questions that it might bring up. I'd like to make sure we have some time for that. But before we do, one of the themes that we find in Leviticus is the priesthood. And the Bible Project has a whole series on priesthood from the Garden of Eden to the end. And it's fun to watch. We're going to pick up kind of in the middle of the series on Moses and Aaron and their role as priest. And so they'll do a little summary of the first video, and then they're going to, at the end, tease the story of David as a priest, because he acts in that role in many ways through the Psalms and through his story. And he is a type of Christ in that way as well. But we're just going to watch the one on Moses and Aaron, and then we'll have some time for exploring Leviticus a little bit more.
The story of the Bible begins in a garden temple with a couple, Adam and Eve, as God's royal priests.
They're supposed to partner with God to take care of creation, and this place where heaven and earth are one is filled with God's blessing.
But Adam and Eve were led astray by a deceptive creature and exiled from God's presence. Their vocation as priests is lost. And with that, all humanity descends into violence. But God promises that a new royal priest will come to lead them back into the blessing of Eden by sacrificing himself.
So later on, we meet a new couple, Abraham and Sarah. God promises that through their family, the royal priest will come to restore the Eden blessing, not just for them, but for all the nations. And so it's this family that grows to become the Israelites. And they eventually journey to Egypt and then become enslaved under the violent rule of King Pharaoh.
So God appoints a man named Moses to represent him to Pharaoh and to mediate on Israel's behalf.
Moses confronts Pharaoh and then leads Israel out of slavery into the wilderness, where they eventually come to Mount Sinai. And here, God appears to all the Israelites, inviting them to become a kingdom of priests.
So he's inviting everyone to be priests, like Adam and Eve were priests in Eden.
Right. But it turns out the people are afraid of God, and they don't want to come close to God's presence. And so Moses goes alone up to the top of the mountain.
And up there, Moses famously gets the 10 commandments. The first two being, worship Yahweh alone, and don't make idol statues.
And Moses sees some really amazing things up there. First, he sees God's heavenly temple, and then also a blueprint of it called the pattern.
All right, plans for the construction of the pattern.
Yeah, it's designed as a symbolic place where heaven and earth are one. Then Moses sees something else, the pattern of a glorious human figure.
The high priest who will work in the tabernacle.
Right, and only this priest can go in and out of the sacred space on behalf of others. He's dressed in white, he wears a crown and is glowing with jewels. He's an image of the royal priest that we're waiting for.
And yet, the man who's called to be Israel's first high priest is the brother of Moses, a man named Aaron.
And while Moses is up seeing all of this, down at the foot of the mountain, Aaron is misleading the people by making an idol statue of God.
So the soon-to-be high priest is breaking the first of the 10 commandments.
Yes. And so God gets angry, and he tells Moses that he's done with these people. They'll just start over with Moses. But Moses stands before God, and he intercedes for the Israelites. He even offers his own life as a sacrifice for their sin.
And while God doesn't take Moses' life, he does forgive the people like Moses asked.
And so when Moses comes down from the mountain, he's shining. like the high priest that he saw in his vision. It's like he's the real priest that his brother was supposed to be, but failed.
And from here, the tabernacle is built.
And then Aaron's family is installed to the priesthood.
But really, even after this bad start,
Yeah, and actually things get even worse. God gives Aaron and his sons really precise instructions on how to test the priests. And then on their first day on the job, Aaron's two sons violate God's commands. And because they're in a place of great privilege and responsibility, God deals severely.
they die inside the tabernacle. Things are not looking good for the priesthood of Aaron.
Right, both Aaron and his sons have failed in their priestly role, and this begins to make us think maybe God's people need a different kind of priesthood.
Maybe one that's more like Moses, who surrendered his very life over to God.
Yes, and while Moses is great, he also fails to be fully obedient to God, and so both he and Aaron die outside the land promised to Abraham.
So Moses was only an image of the kind of priest that God's people will need.
Right, we're still waiting for this ultimate royal priest who will intercede like Moses and offer his life for the failures of others.
The Israelites eventually make it into the promised land, and there they appoint a king and establish a kingdom. Perhaps now God's royal priest can arrive.
And this brings us to King David, and his story is what we're going to look at next.
Priests. It's interesting to think about God's call to the Israelites in Exodus 19. He says, you're a kingdom of priests. And back in the Garden of Eden, he didn't describe it too well in this particular video, but just the idea that Adam and Eve were first created as the in the blank of God, fill in the blank. He let us create man in our own blank image. And of course, Aaron, Moses, they're supposed to be an image, a symbol of Jesus. And God says to the Israelites, I want you to be a kingdom of images of me, priests. Right? And then he says in Revelation about God's people at the end of time, he says, we are made a kingdom of priests. Interesting. This is an important subject to consider. And there's an important connection between the symbol and the real, right? The priest can never act as though he's the real. He simply must stand in the place of and point people towards the real, right? And isn't that what we're called to do? We're image bearers, right? Reflectors of God's image. We stand in the place of God with the words of God and the hands of God and the listening ears of God. And we help people to see the reflection of God in us. Priests. How do you feel about being a priest?
Heavy responsibility.
Yeah. Certainly not an insignificant role. Yeah.
Happy Valentine's Day, honey.
I'm going to go ahead and end this. And oops. Let's stop sharing. Okay.
The first runs it.
I'm going to, Bonnie, I muted you, not because I don't want you to talk, but I just want to make sure that when you talk, you intended to. So let me tweak this a little bit. All right, so if you have a question on our Zoom call, just raise your hand and I'm watching. Before I do, let me... Okay, there we go. Now everybody can see everybody. So Leviticus, you've been reading it. What's been popping up in your minds? What have you been thinking about? Peggy, you're brimming with a question or two or five.
The sanitation, I mean, pouring blood and blood and blood under the altar. I can't imagine sprinkling it around. And then there's the peace offering, the wave sheaf, and they wave something, and then the priest has to eat it, and then they had to stay there in the sanctuary day and night for 7 days. It's just,
So what you just described there about the priests staying there was part of the ordination service.
but
And-
what 7 days? I mean, did they sleep? Did they
Mhm.
eat?
They slept there, they ate there, yeah. Think about Samuel. See, when we read in Leviticus and Exodus and well, mostly those two books, Exodus and Leviticus, we read about the building of the sanctuary. It's like if you were to look at the blueprints of the community event center that we just built, you can see what's there, the walls, the place where the seats might go. What you can't see is what we actually do with it. The women's tea that we held, the men's prayer breakfast that we're going to have in a few weeks, the musical programs that are going to be there. We can imagine what they are, but you can't see it in the blueprints. The blueprints don't tell you all of those details. And even in Leviticus, while it tells you about specific things related to the offerings, this is how you'll do this. We find a little bit later in the book of 2 Kings, I believe, Solomon is building the temple. And even the very specific guidelines that God gave them in the wilderness to build this mobile tabernacle, he doesn't do it exactly like that. He has like 12 lavers and he's got like 7 or 10 sets of candlesticks in the temple. And by the time you get to Revelation, in heaven, it's got 7 candlesticks. Are they 7 branched seven sevens, or is it just like 7 candles on sticks all around? We don't really understand it, but we know that in the temple Solomon built, there were several of these things. And so the specifics, even though they're very important, they don't tell us all of the details of what goes on in there. So read the story of Samuel, and you've got a little boy who is given to the temple. And those are your options. You might remember that you buy back your firstborn. This is a big deal in Leviticus, right? I paid for the firstborn. They're mine. But you can buy back your firstborn of this and your firstborn of that. You don't have to buy back your firstborn camel, because I don't care about the camels, right? The unclean animals he's not interested in. But if it's a clean animal, you either sacrifice it or you buy it back. And if it's your son, you either sacrifice it, give it to the temple, or you give an offering of thanks and buy back your son, so to speak. And so Samuel, she says, I'm not going to buy him back. I'm going to give him to the Lord. And so he does. He stays there in the temple, and you get this idea. He's taking care of the lamps, maybe sweeping, cleaning up after stuff. You have a whole group of Levites that are in charge of the utensils and keeping them clean. And these are things that just tiny glimpses into the day-to-day reality, and we just have to imagine what the rest of it will be. 7 days, I mean, they're supposed to be inside the curtain, not in the holy place, but inside the courtyard of the tabernacle. And yeah, everything happens there. Yeah. What do they do with the bathroom?
I know.
It doesn't say.
What about, there's the parts of the animal that you do this and you do that, and then they have to eat part of it. It just sounds gross.
The long lobe of the the liver. How many times did you read that? The long lobe of the liver, and do this with the long lobe of the liver. What was one thing that went on the altar like all the time? The fat, right? Yeah. Burns up.
So, Pastor, does that mean that when people eat meat, they're not supposed to eat the fat of
He told them specifically not to eat the fat,
and that applies to today?
with one exception. The Passover lamb was not to be boiled. It was to be roasted with its internal organs. And then you were supposed to eat it from, just right there, whole roasted lamb. But other than that, they were like, the things that they were told to do was to take the organs out, and there's certain pieces they weren't supposed to eat, and then they were supposed to take the parts that they could eat, and they're supposed to boil it and drain the blood and boil it. So,
But I thought they were eating manna.
Well, don't you remember early on, they were like, we want meat, and God gave them the quail, but they were also herdsmen. Like, how did they have all these animals? And then also, when you think about these feasts, many of them, some of the sacrifices were completely given to the priest, and it was as though that is what the priest eats from, that's his family's food. Now it says, you eat this in the sanctuary. You don't take it home for your family. So if it's the priests while they're there, and yet there's other parts that it doesn't specifically say what to do with the rest of it. And the practice was, this is part of a festival, or it's part of a thing. You bring the sacrifice, you give pieces of it to the priest and to the Lord, and you take the rest back to your tent, and you and your family partake of this as part of the festival. So you read about thousands of animals being offered, and I mean, there's one place where it's like 30,000 sheep and 20,000 bulls or something are offered at the temple, and one of these priests gives, or one of these kings gives this, and you're like, why? Well, because he's giving it on behalf of the people who might not have it. And the people are taking these sacrifices as a gift from the king. They offer it, pieces of it are taken there, and they go home and eat it. And they have, if you've got 3 or 4 million people, 30,000 is not that much. Right.
But how to do with the remains in the blood, I have to lost my mind.
My sister and brother-in-law were in Marrakesh, which is in what's the country? It's Western Africa. The same country that the city of Casablanca is in. Morocco, thank you. So they were in Morocco, and they were there during the time of Ramadan. And the Muslims will do something similar to the Passover at Ramadan, and they take, not the same thing, but they do something similar, and there's lots and lots and lots and lots of goats, and everybody's got a goat. Everybody's roasting it in a pit right outside their house, and they skin it, and and then they throw the skins into like the trash bins, like we have, the big trash bins, and they'll be like every bin is just filled with these skins, and for a week or so afterwards you can just smell the rotting flesh, and it's nasty. It may be that the kinds of sanitation that they had wouldn't live up to our preference, but they did clean things, and they did have places to dispose of them. You've read the story of Gehenna, or at least heard the word Gehenna. It means a place of burning. Well, literally, it was the trash heap that they would throw their things, like the offerings, and they kept it burning. So, for instance, in Leviticus 16, in verse 27, we're looking at that before the prayer meeting started. It says that the bull and the goat that were offered for the priest and for the people, that the leftovers, the carcass, the skin and whatnot, would be taken outside the camp and burned. Well, Gehenna was the outside the camp. It was outside Jerusalem. It was this pit, and they would throw their stuff like those pieces of the sacrifice that should have been burned, and they would keep that fire burning. And so it says, it talks about the judgment at the end, and it says being thrown into Gehenna, where the worm dieth not and the fire is never quenched. Well, it's this idea that it's this trash heap that's always being burned and taken care of, and that's where the leftover sin goes. It's an interesting illustration. Sorry, I don't know if I've completely answered your question about sanitation, but it's a little bit windy.
The same thing I would say about well, we can come up with all kinds of questions. Same thing with the leftover of the blood, because the priest should go inside, dip his finger on the blood, and it was just a little container, I would say, and they sprinkle the veil with the red that they come out with. They just pour it around the altar, sacrificial altar. And depends on how many sacrifices they were performing every single day. I don't know how, if that will make a wide stream of blood running down the Sanhedrin.
They had ways of controlling that. You'll hear of descriptions, the blood ran into the river, right? So there was some of that they would collect and they would carry out. And when you got to the temple, they actually had ducts and stuff to dispose of that, so that it would get out of the temple. There's a lot about the service that they had to figure out, or at least we don't have all the details of how they did it, and whether God gave them those details or not. Somehow they figured out how to handle some of those things. And you have to figure out the practical ways of doing things.
Well, let's say another thing. The priest goes inside to the holy place and goes sprinkle the blood on the veil right in the front of the when Jesus was serving in the incense altar, and the blood that the priest sprinkle on the veil stays there for a year until the day of the atonement comes over, and that takes care of the cleaning of the sanctuary. Could you imagine how that was smelling?
Yeah, so you have options. Option one,
And besides, we have the incense also.
sure, the incense covers it up, but
No,
one option is that God works a miracle and it doesn't, it doesn't end up rotting and smelling badly. That's one option. Option two is what happens, and you cover it up with incense. Option three is there is a cleaning process that happens. I mean, they don't describe what it looked like. You're not supposed to touch this and you're not supposed to do that, but there are specific Levites that are assigned to carrying this tabernacle with them when they move to a new spot. And every time they moved, they had to disassemble, pack it up, carry it out. Each group had its own little part of that process. Did they clean it at that time? Did they beat out the dust that would blow through the desert at the time? You've got to believe that they cared for God's sanctuary. And if they didn't, then how in the world did it last some 400 years? Till David, 450, maybe 500 years. That is a very sturdy tent. They might have even over time replaced parts of that tent. Let's put a new covering, let's build a new, make a new dividing veil or things like that. Let's clean this. It's time to get it clean.
Didn't God keep the Israelites clothed while they were?
And that's an option that God works a miracle. Yeah.
Master?
Peggy had her hand up and then Bertha.
And then I read in the notes of my Bible that the gold that they used was like tons.
Yeah.
And so I thought, boy, the Egyptians just loaded them up, I guess, with all the jewels and gold.
Well, let's see. If everyone that left Jerusalem, Egypt, took 1 pound with them, you would have 1 million pounds of jewels and gold, right? At least. So yeah, it's about scale, right? If our church were to try to make the tabernacle, it would fail. Like this was a national project, right? But the whole, if you had a million of us, then suddenly something bigger is possible. Yeah, Bertha.
Chapter 12, please.
Okay, Leviticus chapter 12. What are we looking at?
Is the women bearing children. And there's the boy or the girl.
And the girl is like twice as long that you're unclean.
Is this the last 4 days? Is this how it has to be done today?
Okay, so we have like 3 types of rules that come out in Leviticus, Exodus and Leviticus. One of them is a ceremonial rule, and it's relating to the forms and symbols that point towards Christ. The feast days and the fast days, the new moons, the sacrifices, the priests and all the stuff they do. Every one of those things points towards Jesus. And Colossians 2 tells us that those things that were shadows of things to come were nailed to the cross. Jesus accomplished those things. As he puts it, he fulfilled the law. And fulfill means like he glorified it, he completed it, he was the apex of the law. So that's one aspect. Well, the second aspect were laws of cleanliness, like things that related to health, and it's the skin diseases, and it's bodily discharges and things that matter. So if you've got pus dripping out of your skin, God's saying, hey, if you touch anything, it becomes unclean. If somebody touches the thing you touched, it becomes unclean. And we do the same thing today. If you're like sneezing and junk is coming out of your nose, or you have something that's nasty that's on your arm that's spilling out bodily fluids everywhere. I mean, we have hazardous waste. That's what we call it, and we make sure that it's disposed of properly, because diseases can be passed through those things. So we're talking about God giving these laws that relate to health and hygiene, and that keeps the Israelites healthy. And he says, if you do these things that I tell you, then I'm not going to put the diseases of the Egyptians on you. In fact, during the 1919 pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, the Seventh-day Adventist Church published a what to do, for the flu kind of a thing. And what we did is we talked about the Bible, Leviticus's rules about sanitation. Separate yourself, isolate yourself, don't go to school. We closed schools, we closed churches during that time to isolate people and separate them. The pamphlet included suggestions for face coverings, so your bodily fluids don't get over everybody else when you cough and sneeze, or when they cough and sneeze getting on you. We talked about hand washing. Like everything that we talked about during the recent pandemic was in this 1919 pamphlet that the Seventh-day Adventist Church published based on Leviticus rules. So I think that those kinds of laws are healthful laws, and they matter, but I think we can probably extrapolate those things with even more accuracy today because of the understanding we have of disease. So in this context, it's healthy. In that context, it's not. Do this, don't do that. We know some of these things just because we've studied it more. And in a way they apply, but I think that we should, work with the science that agrees with the Bible. The third rule is civil laws, and the civil laws have to do with the governance of Israel at that time. So this is how you'll do these things. Well, we don't live in the desert. We're not Israel. We have civil government, and Romans chapter 13 describes that God has given us civil governments and has given those governments authority over us. So we should submit to them. And so I think that the United States government takes the place of the theocracy of Israel, and some of those civil laws no longer apply. Like how we deal with a murderer. Well, that's up to the laws of our land, not up to the laws of Leviticus. So in this case, I think God is doing something really special. He's saying to a woman, you can't work for 30 days after you have a male child, right? Maternity leave. This is biblical maternity leave. Bond with that baby. You're unclean, which means you can't, like your husband can't come and have intercourse with you. You get a break, which is necessary for the body anyway, right? And your duties, you can't make food. You can't clean because everything you touch becomes unclean, so you can't clean. So you get a break. And this is great news for a woman that's just had a baby. And when you get a girl, twice as long. Bonding, right? I mean, who's going to say this is bad news?
80 days for, yeah.
Should it be the law of the land?
Yes.
I agree. I think so.
And what about the lepers? Well, leprosy. My, I guess my question is, all the lepers would come to the priest for him to say yes or no.
Mhm.
So leprosy was contagious, right? And how come the priest didn't get it?
Yeah, good question. There are a couple things about this that we should be aware of. First of all, it's fascinating that the priests are not just the religious leaders, but they have a civil role. They're the judges when they get to Canaan. They're the ones that oversee the judicial system, and they are also they're not doctors, but they have this public health role, and they're the ones that are going to call a quarantine when the time is necessary over the house, mold in the house over the person. But the second thing we should know is the idea of leprosy. The word that the Hebrew uses is not the word that, say, in Greek, when they translated the Old Testament into Greek, the word that really means leprosy is not the word that's being translated as leprosy in the Septuagint. But we take the Septuagint and some of these translations anyway they do, and they look at Leviticus, and all of these things that aren't the word for the actual disease of leprosy are translated as leprosy. So that kind of can confuse us. And when we study Leviticus and these skin diseases, we can broadly categorize them into, I think, 4 or maybe 5 different categories of skin diseases, all of which, or most of which I should say, are contagious. And like today, we might know them, as the mumps or the measles or smallpox or things like this. We have names for each one. In the Israelites' day, they talked about the symptoms, and they said, if it looks like this, then do this. And so today we would say, if it has this category of symptoms, it's this kind of disease, and we give it a name. So if you had smallpox, would you want to, the priest to isolate you so that others didn't get it? Yeah. And this is a way that the priests can, you got this disease, you go out. You can't be among the camp because if you're around the camp, then everybody gets this disease.
So leprosy was contagious to the touch?
Okay, so
or the
like I said, keep in mind that the word translated as leprosy isn't necessarily the leprosy that we understand today. So leprosy as a skin disease, it's a virus, and it does have a contagion. It's not very contagious, but it is contagious. And so leprous camps, we still have them today, actually. But back in that time, the rules about leprosy were kind of tagged onto the rules about other skin diseases or other diseases that represented in the skin.
Yeah, 15. Leviticus 15.
So nobody has asked the question whether clean and unclean animals still apply today. They do? Yeah. Well, again, this is the health consideration. But I think it's interesting. God says, don't eat animals that you wouldn't bring to sacrifice to me. Well, it's not exactly 1-to-1 ratio here. There are some other things, fish and stuff are never introduced into sacrifices. And he says you can eat these certain fishes, but it's like the lamb, that's a sacrificial animal. You can eat that. The cow, a sacrificial animal. You can eat that. Pig, not a sacrificial animal. You can't eat that, right? There's a correlation.
There's something about also the hooves and whether ate cud.
Yeah, so in Leviticus it says if it chews the cud and has cloven hooves, meaning like the split hooves, then it's clean. And if it doesn't have both of those, like for example, an animal that has cloven hooves but doesn't chew the cud would be unclean. Or an animal that chews the cud
Yeah.
but doesn't have cloven hooves. Yeah, I can't remember how I said it the first time, but the opposite of that, unclean, right? So a horse would be unclean, a donkey would be unclean, an elephant or a tiger or a camel would be unclean, a monkey's unclean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you find actually the incidences of diseases is much higher, like monkeys. Yeah, we got some brain disease going through the world because people were eating monkeys. What was that in the 90s, early 2000s? Remember that? Ebola comes from monkeys. Yeah, that one too. The coronavirus comes from one of those wet markets where they're selling all these wild animals like bats and whatnot. And that's basically God saying, I'd like to keep you safe and healthy. Please eat the things that are closest to the original diet I've planned for you. And I think that that's one of those universal rules. They don't get better with age. Like some people are like, well, pigs are okay because they don't have trichinosis anymore. We've gotten the trichinosis out of them. But if you look at pig farming today, that stuff is nasty. It's one of the worst meats that you can imagine. So whether they're in the wild and have trichinosis or they're farmed and they don't, they're still a big disease carrying animal. So I think that there's a case to be made that meat today is worse than it's ever been in the world. And it is a humanitarian crisis. It is a environmental crisis. And it'd be best if we were all vegetarians. But definitely at least do the clean things. It's going to be better for you.
Well, plus even the clean animals like fish, I think of, I used to be a commercial fisherman in Alaska, and we had one of the biggest salmon runs in the world, in Bristol Bay, and the farming that they're using for salmon, or any fish for that matter, that's close to land, so they're in a pen. All of the pollutants and everything, they go off the land into the water right there, it just pollutes the fish, it gets in their skin, and meat is very toxic to humans, which a lot of people don't even know that.
Oh, and if you study anything about the commercial fishing, the commercial farm fishing, like those are nasty places.
Yeah.
The fish are very, very unhealthy.
So I was in a place this brain surgeon brought his family to do mission work. And so I asked about trichinosis. He said in Canada, you might see a case or two a year. You go to some place like India where they'll eat raw pork. He said he could see patients with trichinosis all day, every day.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah. Nobody's asked the really hard question. What about wormwood or Leviticus, where the man accuses his wife of being unfaithful, and then there's this wormwood test, and she's supposed to drink some water. Yeah, water with some dust in it, and if she's guilty, then she gets her intestines swell up, and if she's not guilty, then she stays fine. Haven't read that one?
Where's that?
That's in Leviticus. There's also Leviticus 14, 1-9. It says, or 4-6 in this case, the priest shall order that 2 live clean birds. This is when the ritual cleansing of a leper, somebody with a skin disease. The priest shall order that 2 live clean birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought for the one to be cleansed. He is then to take the live bird and dip it together with the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop into the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. What?
What? I don't remember that. I didn't see it.
You didn't see that one? Sometimes we're just like, I don't know what that is, and we move on. Yeah. Any thoughts about what that might be? Couple thoughts. In this cleansing ceremony, one bird was killed in an earthen vessel over running water, and its blood was applied to a living bird, to some cedar wood, to some scarlet fabric, and to some hyssop. And then using these things, the blood was sprinkled on the one who was cleansed from leprosy, and then the living bird was let go. So this is when the leper comes back and says, like, am I good? And the priest says, you're all clean, or the person with the skin disease. And then this sacrifice was applied, and some of the blood sprinkled on them, and the live bird let go. Yeah.
So the release of the second bird, is that kind of how like the scapegoat works with sin? So
Interesting.
Jesus goes with the bird.
Okay, yeah. The Holy Spirit came down at Jesus' baptism as what kind of animal? A bird, right? Okay. So there seems to be some kind of a spiritual application. A heavenly being dies in an earthen vessel like Jesus does on earth while remaining clean because it's in running water, right? And you've got the death of the bird that has blood, and you also have the water. Jesus' sacrifice is talked about both as the blood and as the baptism of water, right? The death underwater. And then it's, of course, applied to the living bird, the one that's being cleansed. And the living bird is cleansed by this, the blood and water. And that is symbolic of the cleansing of the individual who is then let go and set free. So that's one way you could think about it. The cedar wood, extremely resistant to disease and rot, might be a reason why it's included there. It's also a symbolic reference that you can tie right to the cross. Jesus was killed on a tree. Hyssop is when Jesus was fed, or they tried to share the drink with him that Jesus wouldn't take. It was a hyssop branch that they used. Also, it was with hyssop they were supposed to put the blood on the doorposts and the lintel of their house. When David said, "Purge me with hyssop" in Psalm 51, he was basically saying, I'm just like a leper, like talking about his sin. My sin has made me like a leper. Cleanse me with hyssop. So there's some connection with this cleansing, purging, cleaning, and the hyssop branch. I don't exactly know why the scarlet fabric or thread is used. It's scarlet, again, representing the blood, but
Seems why the skins of it, they were supposed to be the skins of two different animals on top of all the curtains. The different curtains.
oh, so different context. So yeah, they made the tabernacle, and on top was skins. Yeah, every cover kind of had a meaning, but we kind of dig for those meanings. And I have not been fully satisfied with anybody. People will be like, this means that. And I'm like, show me where in the Bible does it say this equals that? I haven't had a satisfactory answer to that. But there are some surmisings like I've just done about this particular service.
The Bible only mentions that it was for protection of the curtains, probably from the weather, the environment. I don't know.
I think that if you have an animal skin on the outside of your tent, you're more likely to have a long lasting cover than if you have a fabric made of a wool or a cotton. They're going to fray.
It says that
Yeah.
for protection,
Well,
but
I think the American Indians used animal skins for their teepees and stuff.
Yeah.
That's too.
Your skin keeps your blood and everything in you, so I mean, it's protected.
There's blood inside the sanctuary, and the skin keeps it in.
That skin is protected.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But yeah, that's it. There was blood.
There's blood in there. Yeah.
Okay, what about the woman that is accused?
What about the woman that's accused? What is this, old wives' tale about wormwood and the bitter water and stuff like this? I have read a little bit about this subject, and I have not been satisfied with any answer. I can't give you one as to why it happens or why they would use that. There's no scientific evidence that would suggest that a little bit of dirt mixed with water would make a adulterous woman's belly swell up and not make a innocent woman's belly swell up. It's either some miracle that God does, just like the Urim and the Thummim, right? And they have a practice that God works through to illustrate this for justice purposes and to prevent the nonsense of adultery in the camp of Israel. That's a possibility. I haven't been satisfied with any answers, but if you come up with one, please share it. Say that again.
It took more than the woman.
Oh, it took more than the woman to be unfaithful. Yes,
Well,
indeed.
did they put dirty water in a man so his belly would blow up or what?
So the rule in the Bible is that if there's an adulterous relationship, both are stoned to death. It is like done, right? And
But he didn't do that with Mary. Later.
we'll come back to that in a second.
Okay.
In every case, when you find a law in the Old Testament given to Israel, in the context of a wilderness travel, in the context of a place where you don't have jails, right? The kind of, like, why would you kill somebody for adultery? Why would you kill somebody for this or for that? Well, you don't have jails. You can't prevent the wickedness from spreading in your camp. And so you end this, you leave that wickedness there on the ground in the wilderness and you move on. So there's some of these rules that we feel like are just barbaric are so much more merciful and fair than what was in their environment at the time. The culture and the law systems that they were coming from were very corrupt. In fact, it says in the first of Deuteronomy, it says, is it first of Deuteronomy, first of Numbers? I don't remember. It says that these rules that I've given you, when you follow them, all the nations around you are going to look in and be like, wow, you've got an amazing God. Like, these rules are so just and so nice and so cool. Like, we want to be part of your system because that makes a lot more sense than the injustice that I'm experiencing under my God. Right. So in that context, much more fair. But there were things that were very much applied to their culture and their circumstances. We would do things differently, but I think it's just as important to be clear. This is bad. Adultery just is bad for the whole community. Don't do it. And that's one of the reasons why the early Christian church had censorship. Like, you can't lead if you're involved in certain types of sins, and what the Catholic Church calls excommunication, or we call disfellowshipping. I had to think about that one. Like, we send them out of the camp kind of thing. Certain kinds of sin, like the one that Paul describes as the young man who is having an affair with his stepmom, and it's an open sin. It's known in the church, and Paul's like, deal with that. Kick those people out. Don't allow them to stay in this environment, because those kinds of things, when permitted, they have a tendency of, like, the more you see a sin, the less likely you are to feel like it's a sin, like it becomes accepted. So yeah, so there's still, like, certain things are really bad. We should pay attention to them. I don't know if, you mentioned Jesus. I should come back to that really quick. Jesus sees the woman caught in adultery. Who isn't there?
The guy.
The man caught in adultery. The implication.
Some of them that were there were part of it.
The implication of the text is that these people intentionally caught her, which suggests that they trapped her.
Yes.
And you can lead, I mean, that can lead very easily to somebody trapped her, like one of these men maybe, or at least one of their compatriots. So they knew him, or he was part of the plot. They don't bring him to be stoned. So this is
Such as the woman they drugged before Jesus.
They're they're complicit in the crime, which is kind of what you see when Jesus is writing on the ground. Their sins. What sin is that? Well, they're complicit in this one. And then he says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. He who is without this sin is what he's talking about, not just any sin in general.
And, you know, John the Baptist, when he called out sin, he lost his head.
True. Yeah. Well, one last question, if there's, yes, Mac, you'd had your hand raised.
Yeah, in Leviticus 12, the ritual after childbirth. I think in verse number 8. Why does this woman have to give a sin offering?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I would point to I would point to
One's a sin offering.
and one's to buy it back the firstborn, yeah.
Wasn't it go back to the Garden of Eden where the sin for Eve's sin was for pain in childbirth?
That's a thought that I had. And so she has a consequence of sin, and that's the pain in childbirth. But I think that Paul has some interesting things to say about this. He says that we are born in sin. Well, David says it, I'm born in sin in the Psalms. Yeah, conceived in sin. There's something about, and we don't like this word as Protestants, some of us, some Protestant faiths, and the Adventist Church is one of them, have shied away from the idea of original sin, because the Catholic Church has taken that idea of original sin and suggested that you are guilty of Adam's sin. And so when you're born, you have to be baptized right away, or, you know, if you die, you'll suffer the consequences for Adam's sin, even if you've never committed a sin yourself. And we would disagree with that.
Yeah, because you have to be smart enough or wise enough to admit sin.
Yes, and yet, is that baby
Can't admit sin.
is that baby born into sin? Yeah.
God weighs the heart too.
Yeah, no, keep there's a difference here, because sometimes we're trying to make sin into the action of sin, right? So there's the act of murder, the act of adultery, the act of lying, right? These are sin. We clearly know that these are sin, but we know we shouldn't do those actions. But where do those actions come from? They come from a heart of sin. And so the sin, the reason behind the actions of sin, is the broken relationship that we have with God. God designed us for perfect, loving relationship with him. And when Adam and Eve sought to rule the world in their own terms, you know, to be their own person, we do the same thing. We don't let God rule our lives. We want to rule our lives. And the results of that brokenness in the relationship with God is sinful actions. And the same thing is true with each other. The result of brokenness in our relationships with each other leads to sinful actions. We hurt each other. And so I think it's important that we recognize, even though that a child, a baby, hasn't sinned, they're born into brokenness. From the very beginning, the first breath they take, they are born into a broken relationship with God. And I think that it's appropriate for this sin offering, not because the baby has committed a sin or because it's a sin for the woman to have a baby, right? Neither of those things is true, but a recognition that this baby is born into sin, and from its first breath, it must be covered by the righteousness and the sacrifice of Christ. And it's only by his mercy that we live. It's not the same as what the Catholics teach about original sin. I want to be clear that that's a different theology, but I think we shouldn't ignore the reality that we are born in sin. which just means that God's mercy is new every morning, right? For every baby that's born, he is wonderfully full of grace and mercy. Does that answer your question? Maybe a little bit.
I guess everything is just from the beginning where, when God creates Adam and Eve. And it says, the image of God, Adam and Eve was created. And then when they sinned and born came, they delivered a baby at the image of them once in sin. So that's the sin that it was mentioning David, that he was conceived in that condition. The actions determine, that's another thing. But when we born on that falling condition.
Yeah.
Before, when Adam and Eve was created, they were perfect, clean.
Yeah, good. Verna? Let's give Verna a few minutes here and we'll close up with a little bit of prayer.